Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story we are talking about today is episode 46 of my series, Worth 1000 Words, where I write a 1000 word short story based on a piece of artwork. And I know you may think I'm getting a little repetitive here, but I'm doing another one in the apocalypse. I couldn't help myself. I will explain it further when I talk about the artwork and the writing itself. But for now, let's talk about what I listened to. And I'm sure this was expected as well. The Last of Us 2 soundtrack by Gustavo. I'm not going to butcher this. I'll try my best. Santa Olaya and Matt Quayle. So those two gentlemen brought their amazing talents to the soundtrack, and I had a blast. I did play the game. I have my own thoughts to it there. So if you'd like to check out that review from way back when I did these videos in my garage, I'll put a card up for you. But let us move on and check out this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled The Last Day, and it is by an environmental concept artist named Anshuman Kashyap from New Delhi, India. I almost passed this one by because you see a lot of work like this, especially after the release of The Last of Us 2. But it got me thinking. I've done a story very similar to this, where there's a young woman observing a dead body in a bed that has been infested with plant life and overgrowth. And she's constructing the story of this person. She's come into this room and giving this woman her tale. I wanted to do something similar, but not quite the same. Because this one is titled The Last Day, presumably this man is taking one last look at where he stayed for some time. He's left a couple things around as mementos, I guess, at least the note that's leaned up there on the guitar before he takes off. But I wanted to take this idea, this concept, and have him construct a story for someone to find. Because I think in this day and age that finding things that have meaning, regardless of if they have meaning or not, ascribing your meaning to them or them having perceivable meaning is, I think, something that a lot of people would need at the end of the world. And so rather than having this guy having constructed all of this, this is like his stuff that he's left behind. Maybe this is his house, and he's decided to finally take off. There's nothing else for him here. I thought it would be interesting if he fabricated this entire thing for the sole purpose of someone to find it. So that is what I set out to do. So Anshuman, thank you for this awesome artwork. I love the composition. I love the lighting. You mentioned in your description you've always wanted to make something AAA, and I think you have succeeded. Hopefully my approach to the tale does your work some justice. So let's see what I came up with. He stood in the shadowed entryway because it allowed him to make sure the story was right. Christmas lights sagged across the ceiling. A little ambience never hurt anyone, and she liked to dance from time to time, dreaming of those times when electricity was something that just happened, as if by magic. He hadn't found a generator to seed that idea, but emotions were rarely driven by logic. No ladder to be found. Dragging that old desk across the room to reach the beams had been back-breaking work. He rubbed the sore spot that told him it had been worthwhile. On that desk, a mess of papers, post-it notes, and general disarray left by a man who worked too much. The chair skewed enough for a clean exit to retrieve seconds of the half-eaten meal that made his stomach growl, though it had gone cold long ago. The floor he'd left littered with enough debris to give it that lived-in feeling, a reminder that everything could come down at any time, like the world had, and to never get too comfortable. The coffee table looked better by the window, a stack of architectural and art books. He liked painting, and she liked design. However, a children's book he'd put on the top because it got more use than the others, from the boy. The boombox he wasn't sure of, but the boy was an old soul, preferring the hiss of tape to digital perfection. The mug, perhaps too clean, but the man devoured more art than coffee with those smudged glasses. The guitar, strung but out of tune, because he was no musician, held up a slumped note with broad strokes that read, "Music is food for the soul," which made him cringe, but the teenage girl was a terrible poet. Maybe her mother had battled those words with pillows and wall art that read live, laugh, love, though there had been no evidence. All he'd found were old magazines, whose innards now served as family portraits. Lucky for him, a lot of the photos had been free of copy, so they served their purpose. Besides, they were dreamers, the people who'd lived here, layering the walls with people they'd never met to go along with their own memories, because surely they'd have been friends. Standing here, observing the pictures arrayed together as if they'd always belonged, he had to agree. He just wished their smiles were contagious beyond the bounds of the frames. What he felt most were the words he'd written in soot on the wardrobe's door. This couldn't be a paradise full of only happy memories. That would make the newcomers feel too safe, too comfortable, and forget the way things were. The peeling walls and ivy dripping through the ceiling wouldn't be enough. Those things had become too commonplace. But to counterbalance those words, he taped some photos, real photos, at eye level, so at least it would be the first thing they'd see before finding what had become of at least one of the original dwellers, whose whereabouts didn't even exist in his mind. More books were boxed at his feet, as if someone were moving in or out, but they'd been too big for the road, where backpack real estate was better served for the biggest ratio of the hierarchy of needs. The upright spines told of history, adventure, and dogs, because who doesn't love dogs? This family sure had, as much as the art they admired and created, demonstrated by the ones just right of the entrance, tastefully distributed with the best photos he'd been able to find. Weddings, beaches, people smiling in all manner of places. A family. He hadn't been able to construct one fully to discerning eyes, but as he knew, emotions were rarely driven by logic. This was good enough. Maybe if he repeated it aloud, it would feel better. Speaking alone didn't seem right. He had his sanity, along with his rifle. Good pair of boots, relatively clean clothes, a pack lighter than he'd like, but enough to get him on for a few days, and an axe, made for chopping wood, but not used as such. Not much else, really. The upstairs was mostly bare now. Much of its contents had been repurposed down here. And anyway, few people dared halls with closed doors, choosing rather to hide in the open because at least a chance of escape was more likely. He thought about taking one more walk through to check other possible angles, but decided against it, because it might make it hard to leave, his story so convincing. Or was it? When you know all the answers, nothing was, he supposed. After spreading the curtains just a bit more, he returned to his spot in shadow, having stirred up a flock of dust on the rug he'd used to conceal bloodstains. It looked damn beautiful, all of it. In another life, he might have been an interior designer. He sure as hell did it better than the ones who staged model homes. Finally, the smiles in the photos were contagious. He was infected. The view out the door and to where he had to go cured him. Maybe he'd catch it again, out there on the road, when he saw the stars that could have been Christmas lights, when he'd hear the songs of birds that could have been the strum of guitar strings, when he'd see teeth that might have smiled once, for a picture, perhaps, on a happier day. He closed the windowless door because that's what you did. Took to the grass off the path because he was a ghost. He'd never been here. A family had lived here. A father who liked to read but not drink coffee. A mother who liked to dance beneath Christmas lights. A teenage daughter who played guitar and wrote bad poetry. A son who loved dogs and music on cassette tapes. The story was right. So I started writing this thing a little bit different than I would have liked. I was starting to describe the room, but I decided to be more powerful to start with this man. I sometimes fall victim to not describing the actual picture early enough. And I don't want to go on a long description or anything like that. Just something to get the reader, just give them some kind of visual cue as to what's going on. And thankfully, the final words echoed the beginning words. He wanted to make sure the story was right. Hopefully, I seeded exactly what this entire thing was about. Set the expectations up front because I think that can kind of be important depending on what you're trying to do. I mean, if you're trying to write a mystery or something, maybe not. And I think that I just gave enough to where when you get to the end, it makes sense. But reading that in isolation, you may not have any idea what he was going about doing. What was the story? Why did it need to be right? And I don't know why I chose the Christmas lights to start with, but that's where I started. And I think the challenge here was to decide what all these things meant. So I wanted him to be, if you listen to the artwork portion, he's the one who's constructed this. So he did not live here. This was just a place that he stayed for, I don't know, a week, a few days, something like that. And maybe being here alone in isolation made him think that, and maybe he found something. I think that would have been interesting actually to write. Maybe he found something that really upset him, or maybe it was just too bleak, got in his head. And so he was inspired to create a more uplifting scene. However, not completely uplifting because you know that the writing that is scrawled on the wardrobe over there is kind of bleak. I didn't specify what it said, even though you can read in the artwork exactly what it said. I felt like it wasn't really important to go into that kind of detail in this. Although sometimes, again, I'm working on editing the anthology right now, and that is the weakest part I've found in these stories is sometimes you don't quite visualize where these people are. And I think that is just a artifact of looking at the art while I write the story. So I feel like sometimes I don't need to describe it in such detail as if it doesn't exist. So that is definitely an exercise that I'm going through right now. It's a great learning experience to not even look at this artwork, and I definitely don't. I haven't anyway. The last few I've done, I've just read the story as it is, see if it stands on its own, and then tweaked it where necessary. So I was just working my way across this room, trying to construct a story. I didn't identify who lived here or what fictional characters lived here until the very end, the very last paragraph, in fact. And so I had to go back and seed those things early on. And I think that's okay because I was focused more on the elements. And I guess what was interesting about this too is that it's almost as if I was the one or I were the one coming into this house for the first time and seeing everything. And so in trying to figure out like, what does all this mean? What does this guitar mean with a note on it? What does the note say? Why is there a boom box? Or is there a cassette tape boom box by the window? Why is there food left uneaten on the desk? What is written on the wardrobe? What are these pictures on the wall? What are these books on the floor? Why are there Christmas lights hanging from the ceiling? So I think that it was really interesting because I was almost, the POV of the person entering here and trying to construct the story for myself. And then I took that story and that perception back to him, made it his intent. And so that was kind of fun. And I think that honestly, without this kind of prompt, without a visual prompt, I just don't see that being possible. Sure, you're probably going to come up with some stream of consciousness things that are like, a guitar, a note, little elements like that, a teddy bear or something. But I love having the detail of these prompts because, most writing prompts are super minimal. It's like one line, one sentence, maybe a handful of sentences, but that's it. There's really not many visual cues. It's up to you to come up with it. And so that's what I love so much about these is that I'm given so much information about the setting, at least, and kind of, looking at all these little pieces, these puzzle pieces, and trying to assemble them in such a way that makes sense and hopefully does justice to the artwork. And I do try to tag a lot of the artists when I post these because I really like to know what they think. When they hear someone's perception of their art, like I would love to know what their headspace was. I think that'd make a cool podcast, honestly. Like I approach these guys, talk to them about the art, talk to them about what I thought. Man, that's a really good idea. Maybe I should do something like that. I have 46, so that would be quite an interesting podcast. although a lot of them are in other countries, and there's a few that I don't believe are English speaking, so that could pose a challenge. But anyway, sorry about the the tangent. It just seemed like a cool thing just to kind of get in the head of somebody and see what how they felt about the story in relation to what they created and sort of where they were going with it. But yeah, this one was it's funny reading it back, it was kind of it felt a little bit like a laundry list of details. So I'm not sure that it had quite the impact that I was going for. Hopefully I added enough character in there, character content to make you feel for this guy and make you feel for the fact that he took such care in assembling this stuff because he understands this is something that he needed. He stumbled into this house and actually found absolutely not the story he needed, and so he took it upon himself to create one that was hopefully more uplifting. And I definitely talked about this in the other one, but I'm always fascinated by the game designers and the environmental artists and stuff in these games where they're creating these mini stories. When you play The Last of Us or really any post-apocalyptic game, and you look at all the details around all the ruin. However, there's a lot of remnants of things. You always wonder like what's going through their head, like why they chose to put that there. What is the story going on these inside these artists' heads to make them put the guitar in that corner, make them put the filing cabinet there, the desk, whatever. And so this is kind of an homage to those environmental artists, I guess, and of course to the artist here because he is an environmental artist himself. And for those of you who actually play games at a slower pace, like myself, I definitely appreciate that detail. So any environmental artist that ever listens to this, thank you for making these fictional worlds so believable and immersive. Another challenge with stories like these is because there's really no conflict, I don't establish anything. It's difficult to know when to stop. So I was working my way around. You can see I'm a little over 600 words now. I had that paragraph there that says not much else really. The upstairs is mostly bare now. Much of its contents had been repurposed down here. So I was stopping it there. I think it was a little bit too premature, and so I went back and started describing a few more things because I knew I wanted to end it pretty quickly. I didn't want to have too much time where this man was standing there, leaving what was going through his head. I didn't think I had another 300 to 400 words to do that, and so I took it upon myself to kind of move back closer to the door where he was. So bring the story back to where he was, almost as if he started. I wouldn't say he started the farthest away from him. That would have been the desk, but I started with the Christmas lights. But he kind of worked his way around the room, this living room, and then finally ended where he was because, those are the last things he's going to see essentially. And now I'm getting a little more comfortable. I'm hitting 700 words, so I'm feeling good about moving on. And I believe I start to pretty soon here because I'm starting to address, what he has. I'm going back to him. I'm going from the outward to the inward, so to speak, and planting the viewer or the reader right where he's standing, which I think is, it's more world building. He's got he has a sanity. He's got a rifle. He's got a good pair of boots. He's got some relatively clean clothes. He's got, a backpack with some supplies and an axe made for chopping wood, but not used as such, which is kind of a cool little idea. I like the fact that it would have been cool if he would had more odds and ends on him, so I could have maybe done something else like that. But a good wood chopping axe is definitely needed in the apocalypse, or so it appears to be. So now we're at the part of the story. We're at the very end. I got about 150 words left. Starting to, he's putting the final touches on the room. He's spreading the curtains just a little bit more. Returned to his spot in the shadow, having stirred up a flock of dust on the rug he used to conceal bloodstains. So I'm basically painting the picture you see right now at the very end. Even though he was standing there looking around in that same spot, there was one little thing he needed to do. Something just wasn't quite right, and that was letting all of this light into the room, I think. And so I went to do that right before he's leaving. And I think part of it too is, I don't know, I mean, if you've ever moved out of somewhere that has a lot of memories, I think you know what that feels like. It's right. He's just taking one last look, even though I decided that this was not his house. This was just kind of a stopping point. But it was home for enough time to where it had some meaning to him. And he's got to go off and try to find another place, hopefully survive long enough to find another place that's going to be as safe as this one. And now I'm kicking him out the door, essentially, illustrating the fact that he'd never lived here. He was a ghost because the story he left behind is not his. It's about this mother and a father and a daughter and a son. And the last thing I need to do is go back and seed those characters. Thankfully, the end came easily for me. I think that final line seeds right back to the beginning. Sometimes I really struggle with those last lines. They're as important, if not more important, than the first lines for me because it's really the last thing you leave the reader with. And I wish more writers took the care to really make those final lines hit home. Don't get me wrong, a lot of them do, but I read a lot of books where maybe the last paragraph is kind of impactful, but that last line, just that final note, I always attempt to anyway, try to make it have some emotional impact. Almost like, when you're watching a film and it holds on a moment and then it just cuts to black. What does that feel like? I want that feeling to be visceral. I want it to stick with you in your head a little bit. Just like any good film, any good book, any good song, any kind of content like that you can't get it out of your head. That is my goal. But luckily, not too much cleanup. It was relatively easy to add these characters a little sooner. I thought that was important because I didn't want to just surprise the reader at the very end. I wanted him to kind of decide who lived here, respective to what the elements were in the scene. And I promise the next one will not be post-apocalyptic. I know I did 2 fantasy in a row. I did 2 post-apocalyptics relatively close together. I will try to diversify for the next one. Writing time, not too bad. Slightly longer than normal, but not painfully so. And here I am at 1,000 words, taking a final look. Welcome to the end of your viewer. I'm so glad you made it. This is the final thoughts section where I talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, maybe what I learned, and just general feelings about the entire thing. So let's start off with the good stuff. So I feel like I went out and achieved what I was attempting to achieve. That being this gentleman creating or constructing a story in hopes that someone else is going to find it. That's always difficult, as I mentioned in the writing analysis. It's trying to create an interesting story without any inherent conflict because we literally have one person here. Now, it's totally possible. However, the approach that I took maybe wasn't as possible, at least to me. If you have any recommendations or ideas, please let me know in the comments below. And I think the thing I liked most is it was really easy for me to make this thing, the ending mirror the beginning, which I always try to do to some regard, maybe not literally. Here, maybe it was a little bit more literal than some of my other work, but I think it's really important, especially in short stories. Like it's just that cathartic moment. It's that final line that stays with you that is expected, but it's just that final puzzle piece I think you need as a reader. So the downsides, what didn't I like? Well, you could argue that this concept is a little bit played out. I did do something very similar, and I can't remember the title of it, but I will put a card right here as well as a screenshot of the thumbnail so you know which one I'm talking about. And I won't do it again, I promise. I think this is it for me. I don't want to repeat myself too much. And while this did tread familiar ground, I don't believe it was the exact same concept. The first concept being a woman constructing a story based on something she saw, because I think we always do that, right? We see things in nature, we see things anywhere really, and we try to put together what is the story of this object or this place or this person, and that's what she was doing. However, in this story, the man knew the importance of hope in a world like this, and so what he tried to do is construct a story not for himself, but for the next set of people who are going to come here. Hopefully good guys. They might be bad guys though. But I think it was somewhat implied that when he got here, just something wasn't good enough. Maybe it was a very devastating scene. I mean, I did mention that there was blood on the floor that he covered up with a rug. So I think just those small implications helped the reader to know that he did not find something very pleasant. And so he thought, let me make something pleasant. At least let me attempt to do so. So we have this massive living room. I've always noticed in these, the living rooms are so huge in movies too. It's a weird thing. But he had the curtains open wide to let all the sun stream in, and he left little notes and things around. And I understand this is probably not the intention of the artist. I very much believe that he decided to have this man, leave behind maybe a note like on the guitar or something like that. But it's more about him taking one last look at some place that he deemed special. Maybe it was his home that he stayed in for a really long time, and now he's finally having to leave. Like there's nothing here left for him. At least that's my guess. Maybe I was on the same wavelength as the artist, and if so, that's really cool. But I think that's about it for the story commentary. So if you'd like to support the channel, give me a like if you like the video. Subscribe if you like story-related content. Check out my new books. And as always, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.